Over 1,000 years before year zero, you walked out of your home and gazed up into the world of the ancestors. This world, the source of life and death, was no stranger. After all, you celebrated death for everything it potentially had to offer. After surviving a long, toiling experience beneath the earth, within a labyrinth of stone, skull, and bones, you have proven yourself worthy of immortality. But today, the sky was different. Lit up bright in the fluid darkness was an ominous shape of one of God's workmen, the same shape that you have seen carved in stone your entire life. Walking up the hillside, you find one of the wise elders of your community standing at the peak of the land, and you ask him if this angel is a bringer of death. But because you already know the answer, he doesn't bother to directly respond. Instead, he gives you an order to give to the others. He says, "We will need to work together to bury the labyrinth beneath a pot-bellied hill, because the sun has mood swings according to our behavior here on Earth." This is confusing to you. What does this have to do with the sun? You ask him, why would we spend so much time and effort burying something that we have already spent so much effort to build? His answer was as startling as it was mind-bending. He tells you that millions of years ago, dragons ruled the earth and fed upon a small rodent that remained meek compared to the Goliath beasts that ruled the planet, and that this setup was unchangeable to anything of earth, that is, specifically to this earth, and so it remained that way for millions of years. But one day, he tells you, an angel of death, tangibly different from the one you are looking at tonight, came from the sky. He explained that this angel was in fact not of death, but of change, and that our human sight is too limited and temporary to see this eternal truth. Then he gestured over to the chickens sleeping in their pen and spoke, "Those are the dragons that once ruled the earth, and now we consume them." So you ask him with a shudder, "And the rodents? What became of them?" He answered, "They have become us." You see, what we think of as death is actually transformation. God is so powerful that he can turn all dragons into chickens and all rodents into... He was interrupted by a clap of thunder that came from the wings of a phoenix bird that seemed to emerge from that strange shape in the sky. Everything lit up as if day when a vicious pink serpent struck some pillars of the labyrinth, knocking them over. Damn, and now it's your job to fix it, you young stallion, you. Completely calm, the elder spoke. It is time to get this done. The gods will once again be changing the earth. The structure of man will not change, but the beasts of the earth will become smaller and easier to hunt. Excitedly, you exclaim, "Good, this will come in handy whenever we move them to the..." But you are interrupted by the intense glare of the elder as he elaborates. The structure of man will not change, but instead his soul. Mankind will be making a trade. But trading what for what? You scratch your head and you get to it, knowing that he is not speaking mysteriously just to be coy. There are indeed things that he knows that you cannot wrap your mind around yet. The next week was spent burying the labyrinth with debris and loose rock before it was time to move everything underground, because this angel in the sky was becoming more and more violent by the hour, sending more and more destructive birds of prey, fire serpents, and strange mantis creatures to transform the entire landscape according to its will. But you don't worry, you trust its will. All the people, all the schools, all the cattle, all the supplies, everything was taken down into the subterranean city. The work was immense, but you would survive, or at least you thought you would. Because once you were half-assed settled into this new underground home, you approached the meditating elder to once again ask the question, why was so much effort expelled to bury the labyrinth? He spoke one devastating sentence. "We must warn the future generations of the surface, because this generation is going to end." In our Mars video, we left off showing that there are huge gouges chunked out of the planet's surface. These are different from Mars's dried riverbeds and were not due to asteroid impacts. It impossibly seems to be the seed of the war in heaven mythology, considering that Mars is the personification of war in almost every myth. But what really happened? This symbol that has unfortunately become known as squatting man can be found on every continent all over the world, regardless of time period. It was drawn by multitudes of civilizations that supposedly had no contact with each other. If we buy that story, then we are left with a much weirder conclusion, that they all saw the same thing. It would be easy to say that this is an abstract human stick figure if it wasn't for the distinct features like the right angle knees, thin appendages, and elbows pointing directly up and down, and most notably, the two circles on either side. Many of the glyphs also display the neck sprouting off into multiple heads, or one big spiraling head. More elaborate depictions later in time show the figures holding lightning bolts or scorpions on either side while remaining symmetrical. With all of these, if it was found in one glyph, we would say cool, moving on, and let the History Channel have their fun with calling it a mantis alien or something. But all of the above glyphs are found as an archetype in all cultures. Whatever it was could not be avoided and was revered by literally all people of Earth. Fast forward to today, and we don't give our ancient people enough credit. We always blame their activities on superstitions or worship, making us, I think, even more ignorant than we make them out to be. But Dr. Anthony Parrott at Los Alamos did a little experiment. He found that when charged particles move at a high velocity through a magnetic field, it causes pinch points and spirals, like pressured water or like smoke rings, but more stubborn and tough because these charged particles are what we call plasma. And you are looking at it right now inside your screen. And it might just be looking back. We'll get there though, hold on. When we see the northern lights, as we recently did all the way down here in St. Louis, it is basically this same plasmatic state of matter discharged from the sun passing through the Earth's magnetic field. It spreads out in an abstract and beautifully colored display, but it seems that if the discharge from the sun is violent and big enough, it creates synchrotron radiation. The plasma takes on many different forms, like columns and donut shapes resembling entwined serpents, human stick figures, and birds with their feathers fanned out. One might even describe all three together as a feathered, plumed serpent personified as a man. But again, we'll come back to all that jazz. Okay, so the plasma bursts and the petroglyphs look similar. So what? How can we possibly be sure of any connection that long ago? And can the sun even be unstable enough to cause synchrotron radiation to happen in the sky on a scale this large? Well, it just so happens that we have on record in recent history a plasma burst that would, well, it would be small compared to one that would affect the entire globe, but a solid flare-up nonetheless. This was called the Carrington event. It didn't reset the whole damn Earth, but it knocked out communications for a while and miles of trees down for good. And unlike those of our ancient ancestors, we can read the story of the witnesses of this particular event. And they describe, quote, figures in the sky as if drawn with fire on black backgrounds. Notable of the Carrington event is that telegraph operators were able to use their equipment without batteries for some time after the solar bursts. There was energy in the air. This goes to show that if we were advanced enough, we could find a way to benefit from something like this. We also have actual photographs of what are called sprites that occasionally flash very quickly in the upper atmosphere 100 or so miles above the Earth's surface. So sure, these resembling petroglyphs are all over the Earth, but they have another thing in common concerning the location of sketch relative to the longitude dimensions of Earth. The glyph orientations tend to have a southern point of view, and Parrott concluded that the plasma burst in question had a, quote, a relativistic electron flow inward at Earth's south polar axis and hypervelocity proton impacts around the northern polar axis. Basically, the canvas is set up in front of the model. Okay, so if this is so huge, then why don't we see it? Well, if solar bursts large enough to reset civilization only happen every 10 or 20,000 years or so, it is safe to say that many generations between those events would have no knowledge of such events. This is exactly why it might be necessary to get a permanent message carved into stone. And if those warnings are not deciphered, it would lead the scientists of these very generations between the bursts to naively conclude that the sun is much more stable than it actually is. When we say, "Here comes the sun," it rings a pleasant Beatles tune. In Gobekli Tepe, once upon a time though, that song might have been better sang by Travis Ryan. Before moving on, I want to be clear that this hypothesis is not an explanation for strange phenomena. It is simply a furthering of exploration of the mysteries, and in fact opens up another can of worms about plasmatic sentience, literally intelligent awareness that might be watching and studying all the time, and connects us to ancient religions. But just making sure that this video isn't confused with a video dismissing spiritual matters. After all, some of the symbols produced by this plasma experiment that vary from that so-called squatting man resemble symbols of multiple religions and mythologies, most prominently things like this branching out into this, and then those becoming this. A fantastic documentary called Symbols of an Alien Sky. They list many other comparisons between this plasma activity and mythic archetypal symbols embedded into the psyche of mankind, leading me to believe that there is more to this fourth state of matter than just a dead discharge. It might be closer to a someone rather than a something. So what does this have to do with that difficult time at Gobekli Tepe in our intro? Well, they are both connected to the Younger Dryas era. Now, I know you know all about that by now, so let's make this quick. Basically, we assumed that global flood myths were tall tales despite how abundant they are, but we found out about the Younger Dryas event from ice core sediment, abundance of other evidence that we have tendencies to overlook as too weird to be true. The Younger Dryas timeline shows the entire Earth heating up in a matter of days or even hours. Unprecedented. This surely would have caused global floods. But the Younger Dryas was still not connected to the flood myths because there were no civilizations 12,800 years ago. Then the unburying of Gobekli Tepe in Turkey changed all of that overnight, but not without controversy, as Graham Hancock came bursting onto the scene like Stone Cold Steve Austin ready to whoop some mainstream ass. Because Gobekli Tepe shows signs of advanced stonework, intentionally buried with what seems to be pictorial forms of writing that we call glyphs. It also, despite its controversy, showed that our usage of zodiacal symbols is much, much older than we have been told, raising a lot of other questions about the age of what we now call the esoteric. But here's where things get weird. And if that's not weird enough, modern people have unburied a very small portion of Gobekli Tepe. To this day, we have uncovered 2 stone enclosures. There are upwards of 16 to 20 of them. That means that all of this land has ancient knowledge intentionally hidden right beneath the surface. Looking at the rest takes funding that we certainly had, but you wasted on your avocado toast and mocha espresso. Those actually look really good. Now, the theme of this gargantuan setup is death, leading many to believe that it was home to an ancient skull cult. But I feel like we always paint our own biased superstitions onto things outside of our box. I personally feel like this is one of the oldest sacred schools of initiation, and I am hoping to bust out a full video on that, but check out Priest Kings to get the gist of what I mean, because the ancient Egyptians certainly didn't sprout from nothing. Speaking of Gobekli Tepe, geologist Robert Schoch visited this spot on his way to school to see it throw a wrench into our known history live and in person. He couldn't help but notice that Gobekli Tepe is between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, making it a possible link to the Garden of Eden. And indeed, this area over 12,000 years ago was abundant with plant life and multitudes of animals. But what is important here is that Gobekli Tepe has become synonymous with the end of the Ice Age. It seems as if it was built to warn future generations about things that caused the Ice Age in the first place, things that can happen again. Although this warning in stone might not be intentional, that part, we don't know. But if we look at the famous Pillar 43, known as the Vulture Stone, we see clear zodiacal representations and what seems to be a kind of map showing the times and parts of the sky that unleashed this death from above onto the world. We have a vulture gesturing to the sun. What do vultures represent to people of all ages? Behind this, we see abstract designs. Considering that everything else here is representing something in the sky, is it a stretch to say that this is our plasma burst we were talking about? Then moving down the line, we have a scorpion and a decapitated human. Again, representations that don't even need to be explained to the layman. That is what makes symbolism and glyphs work. If this was a written language, the message would be lost with the people who disappeared underground. But the symbolism can be mysterious because at the top we have these so-called handbags that are carried by the gods in multitudes of glyphs all over the world. This seems to hint at a higher power of some sort that sent this epoch of death and rebirth according to its own agenda. Some of the pillars show signs of being knocked over and then hastily put back up without being carefully and permanently fixed like the other stones. This seems to indicate that there was a catastrophe going on literally during the intentional burying of this site. And like they say in forensics, we see signs of a struggle. Roughly speaking here, when you put it all out on the table, it looks like there was a catastrophic event that caused the Ice Age, and then civilizations built and maintained these structures to represent that as an occurrence to be remembered, and for good reason. Then another plasmatic catastrophe thousands of years later melted all of that pent-up ice, causing the global flood of all religions, at which point it was game over, and the fantastic attempt was made to preserve this knowledge. Now, this is hypothesis and doesn't exclude the usage of Gobekli Tepe for other activities, and it is silly to think that way. We tend to think of others, especially ancients, as narrow-minded and simple. This site, like the pyramids of Giza, may have had many different purposes. Hell, we do that with our modern sacred sites. The Starbucks where you got that mocha cappuccino doubles as an office for people to write emails. The local Walmart doubles as a trailer park cage match for fist fights and is a perfect runway for pajama models to show off their not so discreet fashions down the catwalk of the alcohol aisle.
We're gonna cut that.
So why plasma and solar flares instead of a comet as we once very recently thought? Well, there is no crater large enough to account for a global reset. And in the book Forgotten Civilization, Robert shocks us with at least 7 verifiable cases of drastic solar activity in more recent times, as well as insists several times that his wife co-wrote the book. Frankly, enough times to seem like the archaeological equivalent of a joint Facebook account. I'm obviously kidding and probably out of sheer jealousy. I mean, she is smoking hot. And Rob is kind of a goober. The evidence comes to us mostly in the form of dendrochronology, which is the study of tree rings and how the inside of a tree can tell a story of 1,000 years, as well as a close look at ice core samples. Throughout the book, he makes the case that our modern systems of communication and power is too frail to handle one of these solar outbursts, and that we need to start paying attention to these ancient warnings. I mean, we have the equivalent of thousands of ancient voices speaking in unison through these glyphs, all saying the same thing, that the cosmos is not as stable as it seems. If one of these was to hit today, there would be nowhere to run. There would be mass chaos with no electricity, no way to speak to others at a distance, food shortages, and no running water, and even worse yet, a solar outburst like this might even affect my YouTube numbers. So we certainly have built our entire society on a house of cards. To illustrate how frail human life on Earth can be, even without dependence on electrical technology, let's go back 70,000 years to the Toba catastrophe, where the Homo sapien population dropped to roughly a couple thousand people. Had this been any worse at all, there would be a completely different dominant species of humanoid in charge here today, and thus a completely different world. And this number is not to be confused with gradual population growth, because the population bottleneck here resembles an hourglass in shape when you graph it out as population being equal to width and the time moving from top to bottom. You see the chart, I'll shut up. In one of the most recent solar events in the year 1052, the Scottish Chronicles recorded this account. A tower of fire seen at St. George during the space of 5 hours, blackbirds innumerable going into and out of it, and one large bird in the middle of it. This certainly seems to indicate a solar outburst, but even more interesting is the description of these birds. If we look at the figures modeled by Dr. Parrott, we could easily make the connection to the unusual plasma patterns that happen with high velocity particle impact on our magnetic field. It is worth noting that blackbirds of all sorts have been considered an omen of violent or sudden transformation in the mythology of that area. Gobekli Tepe is brimming with mysterious lore, zodiacal representations, therianthropes, and anthropomorphic depictions, signs of disaster, precision stone reliefs of birds bringing death from above, underground safe places, and so on. A list that reminds us a lot of the most remote location on Earth, a place that certainly must have had no connections with these other locations that depict this mortal theme. A location called Easter Island. The navel of the world is called an emblem of ancient mysteries by Robert Schoch. Easter Island is over 1,500 miles away from any other bit of land. It was discovered on Easter Sunday, 1722. And you can imagine how boggled these seamen were when they saw the giant stone faces keeping watch over the island. These moai are about 10 meters tall and weigh up to 75 tons. You might have recently seen a project on TV where people were moving a replica of one of these moai by rocking it back and forth with ropes. Very cool, if you ask me, and a great theory. But what was not addressed on that show was that they were moving a replica made of lighter and more cavernous volcanic rock. The original moai on the island were finely detailed out of hard basalt and were not volcanic tuft. This walking of the moai was unfortunately meant to deceive, and it generated a lot of money. The hard basalt stone throws a wrench into a couple items here. Why did they use it? Basalt is too heavy to do that with, sure, but why carve into it instead of lava rock? Basalt is harder than steel. What stone carving tools were used that outlasted the hardest stone that there was? What makes this fascinating is that the island is indeed rich in volcanic tuft, but the hard and heavy basalt that the original moai was quarried from, we don't know a location from. A spot to get these giant stones has never been found. To put that into perspective, Stonehenge was quarried from hundreds of miles away in Wales. Wales, the place, not to be confused with the mammal fish, to be clear if Sean is watching. Moving these giant stones quarried from that far away is a real mystery with Stonehenge. But on Easter Island, we don't even have a location to go off of. And don't go telling me that they float. And yes, the basalt quarries might just be under sea level now, but this creates another mystery. If they are under the water, that dates the original Moai to extreme antiquity due to the ocean levels rising at the end of the Younger Dryas era, making it as old as Gobekli Tepe. To clarify for the comment section experts out there, yes, there are volcanic quarries on Easter Island, and Moai have been made from those. We can see that. But the original Moai did not come from those. Much like we see in Egypt, a later yet still ancient people were attempting to replicate the OG structures of a much heavier stone. Another example of less skill over time and not the expected opposite. Okay, the Moai were buried up to their neck a very long time ago, and this reminds us of Gobekli Tepe. It has been hypothesized that the sediment drifting down naturally buried these stone figures, but Robert Schoch argues that a mud flow or a landslide would have knocked these tall guys over, or at least tilted them a bit, and as we can see, they are perfectly plumb. And speaking of them being buried up to their necks, this part is a lot of fun, that notion, because for the longest time, all we could see was the heads. It was an internet theory that they had bodies, and this was obviously ridiculous and was not taken seriously, so it transformed into a sort of viral meme joke, and those were a lot of fun too. But how ironically, almost comically strange it was when they started digging down and found out that, just like about everything else, we were only seeing the tip of the iceberg, because all the important work on the Moai was in glyphs right there on the backs of these tall guys, and unbelievably so, buried and preserved for us to see today. That messenger pigeon made it all the way to us thousands of years later. And what did this carrier pigeon bring us? Well, the same glyphs that are found in Gobekli Tepe. Come on, let's take a little tour. First of all, the Moai are predominantly male, with only few female characteristics. This reminds us of the very phallic Gobekli Tepe, where the only female depiction is just, not pleasant, but of course beautiful in its own way. Robert Schoch describes many low to the ground and thick-walled stone structures that appear to be constructed as if they were made to withstand a direct hit from a powerful aerial bomb. It seems as if the inhabitants needed these shelters for intervals or periods of time. Robert calls these vitrified forts. And why vitrified? Well, vitrification is what happens when stone is heated to such a degree that it transforms down to the molecular level into a kind of glass. It just so happens that many of these heavy roofing stones used for these very forts are in fact vitrified on the top. This is mostly known to occur from very powerful lightning strikes. A lot of this has sparked debate as to ancient usage of nuclear weapons as depicted in super ancient Hindu texts like the Mahabharata. But with this new science concerning plasma blasts from space, perhaps we have a double lead in both directions here. This is, of course, speculation, but the stones themselves don't lie. And, of course, we have the underground cities in Turkey near Gobekli Tepe. There was something very dangerous in the sky for a long time. These underground cities were not just a hole in the wall either. To quote Robert Schoch, over 200 underground complexes are reported in Turkey. most have not been adequately explored. To this day, nobody really knows the true extent of these or the underground cities of the area, but they were substantial. Göbekli consists of at least 8 floors or underground stories, only 4 of which are currently accessible, each extending in a labyrinth manner over a vast area. The city may have supported a population of 3,000 to 4,000 people, plus farm animals and supplies, all housed underground. Derinkuyu, with an estimated 20 floors and extending an estimated 85 meters below the surface, may have supported anywhere from a few thousand to 10,000 people, plus their livestock and goods. The underground cities may not have been entirely isolated from one another. Göbekli and Derinkuyu are less than a dozen kilometers from each other, and there are reports of a tunnel that may have connected them. There were storage areas, wineries, kitchens, dining rooms, bedrooms, schools, and churches complete with naves, altars, and seating platforms for the congregations. They might be living even finer than we are now here in this Great Depression. Speaking of death from the sky, we have matching petroglyphs of the same birds in both locations, strikingly similar in their comparison to the zodiac symbols of each. Keep in mind what we learned about plasma in the beginning of this video as we look at these matching glyphs and pillars of both locations. Here we are looking at Pillar 18 Enclosure D at Gobekli Tepe. We have the cunning fox and the interesting shape of the thin arms and placement of the hands. But the most lingual of it seems to be the belt. We have what looks like a capital H surrounded by crescent-looking half circles. Where the belt buckle would be, there are more inverted H's with a bowl shape in the middle, and then 3 fingers drooping down from the center, with the middle one being the longest. It is important to keep in mind not to paint our own psyche onto these messages in stone. This is not literally an H, and that is not a belt buckle. We have to look at this from a brand new point of view with fresh eyes, and sometimes that takes a little bit of effort. It's probably not helping that I called them that, but anyway. On the back of this moai at Easter Island, we also have what seems to look like a belt with 3 fingers drooping from the center, and the middle one is the longest. The hand placement is also the same, and staying on this same stonework, we see petroglyphs of birds and symbols that directly match those of Pillar 43 at Gobekli Tepe. This strange H shape was also found in various ancient sites all around the world, and indeed was just as important as the bird-like depictions of the zodiac, most notably in Pumapunku on the same site as the ominous Gate of the Sun, a gate of which is of the sun. Taking all of this in, I'm just gonna show this on the screen here, some illustrations from Robert Schoch's book directly to you. And doing so, I might as well add that I'm not paid or sponsored to talk about this book. I might make $1 if you use my link to buy it though. And each video has a book link or 2 in the description. I will say that this is easily one of the best units that I have read concerning the ancient mysteries, but it also talks about something else that I find to be fascinating, which is how the plasma might be in communication with human DNA through ELF radiation, but that'll be for a different video soon. A plasma apocalypse, powerful enough to reset the Earth and send the course of human beings down a completely different path. A path that it might be consciously choosing, yet a disaster to us, making it quite suit that the human word disaster can be broken down into its original segments as diseased star. But what can we learn from the nature of plasma, besides the fact that we should better secure our own electrical communication systems, which should be obvious by now? Well, personally, I feel a sense of zen instead of fear. Let me explain. It seems that every religion talks about, in the beginning, the waters of the above mixing with the waters of the below to create what is and can be. And we know that plasma, although not a liquid, is still a fluid. This can easily be called the primordial waters of chaos by ancient people who did not have the scientific word fourth state of matter and plasma. And to be frank, their ancient descriptions are probably more easy to absorb considering the deeply symbolic richness that illustrates the mystery instead of making us bust out a dictionary. Plasma is a fluid. Water is a fluid. Both retain great deals of information on a level even more micro than DNA. They have memory, and where we have memory, we also have a form of sentience. Water flows and gives life to all things, yet it also does nothing. Plasma flows and destroys life, yet it also does nothing. Through this ebb and flow, we can learn the way of Zen. We can force our desires all we want, but in the end, we die anyway. But if we are a fluid, like a cat, we can also do nothing, yet unbelievably so, at the same time, leave nothing undone.
You know, quick reminder, your world seems stable. In a catastrophe, if the power grid system goes down, everyone, black, white, gay, straight, rich, poor, we become biologically equal. This song is called 7 Billion Dead.
We should depopulate and rid the scum of the earth, resort to genocide and clean the thin upper. Cause the majority of people already sleep, their good is dead to me. So past the point of helping, I would kill every politician, every lawyer, every judge, every single fucking company that bullet first gun. Democrats, Republicans, and liberals are alike. If you fell for that lie, there's no excuse for your life. I feel ball in this ball, helpless, holding his face, and it never be responsible for killing our races.
Brandon Deering on the cellos, guys. What do you think?